The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 901 Lex's Boat. Instead of directly moving on, Lex studied the three dead assassins for a while. Their bodies did not disappear once the test concluded, so Lex had the opportunity to learn something from them, even if just a little. With his left eye, he studied their bodies, looking for traces of abnormal laws, while he used his hands to check their bodies for unusual muscle growth. He also searched for any treasures or items which may have had special effects. The fact that these assassins had been able to hide from him was not ordinary, especially since they were in the same realm as him. To compare, the devils who had attacked him back when he was absorbing divine energy from Ra were at the peak of the nascent realm, but none of their techniques worked on him. Whether they tried to curse him, physically attack him, use techniques, or anything else, they firmly remained under the supervision of his senses as well as his instincts, so he knew at all times that none of their attacks would work. In comparison, these assassins could not hurt him either, but did manage to avoid detection. There was a better way of finding out the answer, which was to ask Mateo. Lex planned on doing that as well. But he wanted to conduct his own investigation first and then compare his conclusion with the answer. They had nothing on their person save some weapons, but studying their bodies did reveal something. Their skin had undergone some kind of treatment. That did not directly make it easier for them to stay hidden, but Lex suspected that this treatment perhaps amplified the effects of some technique. The corpse assassin had undergone a similar, yet different, treatment. It was probably one which allowed him to use a technique that made him appear dead. Once he had learned everything he could, he finally moved on. No longer dwelling on the differences in the deeper parts of the temple, Lex asked Mateo how the assassins could stay hidden so well. Everything in the temple is to the standard of the temple. Those assassins were designed to mimic real assassins from one of the best of such organizations at the time. Your instincts are prophetic in nature. That means they use a combination of your enhanced senses as well as some influence from the laws of fate, destiny, probability, and many more as such. So then confusing them is simple. The target need only hide from those laws, or better yet, manipulate those laws so you sense nothing instead of them. These assassins in particular were trained and cultivated in such a manner that their bodies were ignored by those laws on a lower level. As a result, this test was conducted as if someone really wanted to assassinate you, and had studied your abilities and attacked accordingly. The fact that the assassins were limited to your own level was a limit of the test, but if you had faced the same test at a higher level, not only would the assassins have been prepared specifically to counter your abilities, but their cultivation level would have been different as well. I thought low-level cultivators couldn't use laws, Lex commented, slightly bitter that his deduction had been off. But at the same time, it was interesting to see how his exposure affected his worldview. If he increased his knowledge substantially, something he suspected the temple could help with, there would be fewer chances for him to be caught unaware. They don't. The assassins themselves don't interact with laws at all. It is just that they have been trained, and then cultivated in such a way that their bodies mimic the effects of a physique. They have false or fake physiques, or that's how you can understand it. Basically, someone much stronger than them is responsible for giving them this ability, but they are harvesting its benefits. Lex contemplated on this while he was led to the next test. Feeling no need to rest, Lex entered immediately and found himself standing on a small fishing boat. The waters around him extended endlessly until they met the horizon, which could only be seen for mere moments amidst the storm. Heavy rain pelted him and his boat, while lightning and thunder rocked the skies. Large tumultuous waves threatened to capsize the tiny boat and swallow Lex into the dark waters underneath. Although Lex did not suffer from thalassophobia, he was not exactly keen on entering the water. He immediately erected shields around his tiny boat, and then formed space barriers around it as well. Lex had reduced his reliance on arrays as of late, but that did not mean he had forgotten that he had it in his arsenal. Without waiting for some deep-sea creature to attack him, as he suspected might happen in this test, he used a stronger, more refined version of his lightning tribulation array. The clouds and lightning above only fed into his array's power, increasing the potency of his attack. Like the hammer of judgment, a thick bolt of lightning slammed into the tumultuous waters. For the briefest of moments, the darkness below was illuminated and Lex's pupils shrunk. It was not one deep-sea creature underneath, but a whole host of them. They were coming from the depths, and approached his tiny boat while encircling him. The nearest one was already almost upon him. The lightning strike had momentarily stunned it, but it was not enough to stop it. As daunting and horrific as the situation seemed, Lex was not deterred. Between him and the deep-sea creatures, it was yet to be determined which one was the monster. Standing upon the boat that seemed completely unaffected by the waves, Lex began conjuring dozens of arrays. Lightning struck the water, and the waves reached out to the heavens in defiance. Instead of a test, this seemed more like a battle between myths from Earth, Zeus and Poseidon. In between was Lex, his boat an undisturbed bastion in the endless chaos. Chapter 902 Not Again. Unlike the previous tests, where Lex won after exchanging just a few moves, this one took him a little over an hour. The deep-sea creatures, still in the golden core level, seemed to have a very strong resistance to lightning. The only reason they took any damage at all was due to the tribulation attribute attached to those specific lightning bolts. It was a trap which took advantage of his assumption that lightning would naturally work well against creatures in water. It was only after Lex had this realization and changed his form of attack that he made some significant progress. All Lex needed to do was rely on his left eye to check their weaknesses. If he had done that from the start, he would have avoided wasting time, but he had not since he had made an assumption. This particular test did not teach him to rely on his left eye, contrary to what it may seem like. Instead, it just emphasized his need for knowledge. If he had known about the creatures from the beginning, he would not have made a mistake. Of course, the simple oversight reminded him that he should always use all the cards available to him. The creature's weakness was light. The brighter their environment, the more their own biology would prompt them to enter hibernation. All Lex had to do was illuminate the map using his array and all the creatures became extremely drowsy. That also allowed him to take his time and easily target them with evisceration. The test was still within his capability, but it had pushed him to use more of his arsenal. Lex's limited combat experience with different enemies made it so that he usually stuck to one kind of skill or ability. These tests were forcing him to use more of them, but that was only increasing his own familiarity with his own abilities. Although Lex had not officially begun training, he was already stronger than when he started. Still far from exhausted, Lex hurried to his fourth test. He was enjoying them now, and looked forward to what his next challenge would be. As soon as he entered the next gate, and once again began the test, he found himself in a lava-filled cavern. The environment was complex, and there were many tunnels leading deeper into whatever area he was in. But reaching the tunnels was not so simple. Rivers of lava flowed all around him, and a few lava falls also obstructed his path. The energy in this environment was also boiling, and Lex suspected that if he had not bonded with Lotus, he would have faced some minor irritation while absorbing this energy. Due to waves of heat that seemed somehow radioactive as well, Lex could not cross over the lava rivers, nor come anywhere near the flowing lava. The ground he was standing on was only slightly higher than the rivers and displayed signs of approaching a melting point as well. His feet were already somewhat sinking into what should have been solid rock. If Lex knew his new weight, that would have made sense, but he did not stick around to see how long it would take for him to drown in rock. Using his left eye, his spirit sense as well as his more mundane senses, Lex studied his surroundings as he tried to gain some distance from the lava. He was also on the lookout for enemies, but so far, he had not detected any signs. After walking around for a bit, Lex concluded that at one point or another, he would definitely have to cross the lava, for there was no access to any of the tunnels from where he stood. He used harden and erected a few shields around himself before leaping over one of the rivers. He anticipated an issue while crossing. After all, this was a test, so how could it be simple? But even he was not prepared for the fact that his shields caught fire as if kindling brought close to a great flame. Since Lex was on guard, he immediately identified the problem. As expected, the lava that surrounded him was far from ordinary. It was burning up anything that contained spirit energy, save for the very hot energy that filled the cavern. Or perhaps, that burning hot energy was the residue of every other kind of energy being completely burnt. Lex immediately cancelled the techniques lest the fire follow the energy to him and directly start burning his golden core. But while that put out the flames, he was left exposed to the hot air above the lava. As if composed of the most toxic and corrosive gases, they buffeted him, leaving a fierce burning and irritation all over his skin. His baby hairs, nearly invisible though they were, burned to a crisp, leaving his delicate skin covered in ash and soot. With watery eyes, Lex jumped forward to build a distance between himself and the lava, hopefully getting closer to an exit. It was unusual that the hot air affected him so badly even though he had stayed far from the lava, but that only motivated him to keep his distance. As he wiped his eyes and entered a tunnel leaning upwards, he did not drop his guard. This was the perfect opportunity for him to be ambushed. The ground trembled beneath his feet and a shockwave traveled through the cavern, causing a few rocks to fall from the walls into the flowing lava beneath. Lex froze as a sense of horror filled him. That was not the tremor of a massive creature approaching, no. It was an earthquake, and in such a situation, Lex could not help but think that it was a prelude to an eruption. No, please, not again, murmured Lex as extended his senses to his utmost and picked up his pace. How many times had he run from a volcanic eruption by now? Why did it always have to be lava? He'd like to get caught up in an avalanche from time to time, and get some distance from all this heat. Even as he ran, a premonition filled his mind. Most likely, the eruption would happen soon. Chapter 903, Not a Bad Idea. With danger imminent, his instincts once again began to do their job and provided him with a solution. The answer to his problem was straightforward. The network of tunnels he was running through was extremely complicated as is, and had an added layer of difficulty due to the fact that they were arranged in a formation of some kind. The purpose of the formation seemed to be specifically to confuse him. No matter how much time he took, and how he explored the tunnels, he would not be able to find an exit. In such a situation, the answer should have been simple. All Lex needed to do was dig upwards to exit, right? Unfortunately, even that seemed to be a trap. Vaguely, he could sense that gravity was being manipulated within this vast underground network. What he thought was down and up may actually be deceiving. There was no way to determine which direction the exit was in. Although Lex was not out of options, for once he had no way at all to see through the formation that trapped him. When he looked with his left eye to study the laws, he was indeed able to see the ways to make the formation stronger or weaker. His left eye always showed him a way to progress or degrees how the laws behaved contained within anything he looked at. The only difference was that previously, whenever he saw a method to weaken or break through, there was an element of physical weakness to it that he could exploit. But the formation around him was exceptional in ways that were beyond his understanding. If he wanted to destroy it using physical strength, he would have to grow stronger by an order of magnitude. The next easiest way to unravel the formation, or manipulate its associated laws, was by manipulating some other laws to act on it in certain ways. That was beyond Lex's ability. In short, he was too weak to destroy it, and lacked the relevant abilities to unravel it. He was sure that there must be other ways to escape the situation, since the test was ultimately designed for golden core cultivators. But he was unable to discover that method in the limited time he had available. But this was far from enough to demotivate him. Even if Lex could not escape, there were other things he could do. Despite the fact that he had a new cultivation technique which allowed him to learn offensive techniques and master other things, till now what he was best at was defense. Lex stopped running and studied his surroundings. The tunnels seemed like they were made entirely out of one massive rock with no breaks or joints in between. There was no lava flowing through the tunnel where he stood, but one could easily imagine that this would soon become a path for lava to flow through once the eruption occurred. Perhaps as the size of the tunnel might even increase as the exposed rock slowly melted under the raging heat while the lava flowed. This meant that even the rock around him was not enough to withstand the heat, but if there was enough of it. Lex's eyes gleamed as he summoned his sword and walked to the tunnel wall and began cleaving. His sword, channeling a torrent of his spirit energy through it, cut through the stone piece by piece, leaving behind small, misshapen blocks. His right hand held the sword, but his left hand was focused on drawing arrays. The heated spirit energy in the cavern surged towards the arrays Lex drew, and then seemingly disappeared. For a while, there was no visible reaction. Another tremor spread through the cavern, warning that the inevitable eruption was coming ever closer. Lex had cut out a small tunnel as he kept removing blocks of stone, and he did not seem to have any intention of stopping. Yet a change happened nonetheless. The rocks that he had piled together started to turn red. At first, the color change was not too prominent, but eventually when the whole pile changed color, it could no longer be ignored. Even the new rocks Lex placed on the pile quickly began to change color. Under the influence of the arrays Lex was continuously using, powered especially by the heated energy, the rocks finally began melting. As if guided by an unseen hand, the liquid rock moved towards the tunnel and began to line the wall, at which point it began to rapidly cool. The newly formed rock was darker in color compared to the surrounding rock, so Lex could not be certain if it was of the same type. Whether it could tolerate the heat of the eruption like the surrounding rock was uncertain, which is why Lex was determined to use as much of it as possible. In just a few minutes, the tunnel Lex had dug had been resealed, though Lex continued to dig deeper for a while. Once he was satisfied by the distance, he sat cross-legged and began his second round of preparations. The characters he used in arrays were originally found in nature, and had certain effects even when on their own. Back in the crystal realm, Lex had also seen how a single character had been used in the design for the entire prison. As such, he began to carve out a massive symbol around him, channeling the ambient spirit energy into it. This was not an array, but the character was the closest thing to meaning barrier in a single character as far as Lex knew. The purpose of this character was not to protect Lex, but to add a sense of harmony and nature in the barriers he was about to erect. After all, nature was the closest thing to perfection, so he hoped to rely on it for help. Once that was done, Lex began to use his spatial affinity to condense space around him in the shape of a ball. This would not create a space barrier, but would turn what was originally a small distance, such as a few feet, into hundreds of feet. Or at least, it would replicate the effects of that. One by one, Lex put up his defenses. At the same time, he made a mental note to look up techniques to help him absorb the energy from an eruption. Suddenly, Lex froze. Actually, that was not such a bad idea. Chapter 904 Extreme Measures. A plan took form in Lex's infantile mind. His plan was based on the level of confidence he could summon up on his own ability to survive hazardous conditions. After a moment of contemplation, Lex was fairly confident that he could survive, not that these tests would kill him anyway. With his plan set and decided, he continued to put up various defenses while specifically avoiding having any that contained spirit energy. After all, this particular type of lava, or fire, seemed to burn it right up. These defenses included, but were not limited to, arrays that specifically absorbed heat energy to work, space barriers, compressed stone and walls of supercooled rock which were cooled through the use of arrays. No sooner had he finished that a massive earthquake came, much stronger than the ones he experienced before. Before the tremors had an opportunity to subside, a massive explosion rocked the entire tunnel network, shaking even the burrow Lex had created. The temperature drastically increased all of a sudden and a continuous roaring sound engulfed Lex, as if there was heavy machinery at work all around him. Lex could not tell if the ground was shaking because the earthquake was still going on, or because of the heavy, continuous flow of lava in the tunnels all around him. Either way, the fact that his hiding spot had not instantly been blasted open meant that he had a good chance of surviving this test without issue. But that was no longer Lex's goal. He extended his spirit sense to study what was happening outside, and quickly learned that the rock around him was melting much faster than he anticipated. All he needed to do was continue to cut into the rock in the opposite direction and he would avoid all contact, but he did the exact opposite. Now that he had survived the initial blast without issue, he began to remove the many defenses around him, and even tunneled closer to the lava. When he reached the point where he could see the rock turning red, he stopped tunneling at last. He removed his stealth suit, lest it be destroyed, and sat cross-legged in nothing but his underwear. He added some fail-safes, just in case they were needed, before putting his back against the melting rock and began to cultivate. At first, the heated rock felt like nothing more than a warm towel on his back. The transition from that to feeling like he had entered a hot sauna was pretty quick. The rock finally began to melt, yielding under the massive heat and pressure of the flowing lava on the other side. But Lex did not allow the entire wall of rock to melt, but instead left only a portion of it unsupported. The sides of the wall were being rapidly cooled using his arrays. This way only a small amount of lava started to drip and fell onto Lex. It was clear that Lex's means would not last, and it was only a matter of time before the entire wall gave way, but his intention was never to stop the lava completely. He just needed to slow it down while his body and cultivation technique adapted to the heat and pressure. As thick, massive drops of lava fell upon Lex's bare skin, his cultivation technique absorbed the heat from it as if it were ambrosia instead of lava, and began altering his body. For a time, the lava seemed unbearably hot, even burning his fragile skin, but Lex eventually lost himself in cultivation. Ads by Pub Future. He did not notice when his arrays stopped working, or when the wall rapidly began to melt. He did not notice either when it gave way entirely, and a current of lava fell onto him, carrying his smoking body with it. He did not even notice it when his hair burned off completely, or when his skin started to cook. That was because the greater the pressure Lex faced, the faster his cultivation technique altered him. He was changing at a noticeable, perceptible speed. Not only was he growing stronger, his cultivation was improving drastically. This was the first time he was cultivating since he bonded with Lotus, so he was taken aback by the massive boost it provided. His body had long been carried away by the flowing lava, and though he suffered burns over every inch of his skin, before the damage could become substantially threatening, the lava stopped affecting him. Neither its weight, which could barely compare to the liquid he bathed in when he was bonding with Lotus, nor its heat could affect him anymore. In fact, his body was rapidly absorbing the heat and healing him at visible speeds. A tornado of spirit energy formed around him as he cultivated, and the eruption actually slowed down as the lava around him began to cool. In just 30 minutes, Lex went from being in the middle of the golden core realm to the top. If this continued, it would only be a few hours before he reached the peak, and was ready to change his realm. Mateo, who had been studying Lex's actions to decide his training regimen, threw the clipboard onto the floor as he discarded his current plan. He would need to come up with another plan. But, instead of starting a new plan on his own, he made a tough decision and used his authority to wake someone else up. This was not fair. He was just a ground manager. Why did he have to deal with a freak? For that, it was better off if he let another incomprehensible freak deal with the situation. The process was not straightforward, as waking someone up from dormancy was not a quick thing, even if it was a projection. To be fair, none of them were only projections. It was just that a portion of their brains were being woken up while the remainder of their body continued to be dormant. It was not time to wake up, but extreme times called for extreme measures. Chapter 905, Cassandra Van Zagnew. In the end, Lex's fourth test did not end like the rest. He did not walk out of the test after completing it, but rather, the testing site ejected Lex when he clearly possessed the ability to survive, but would not leave. Seemingly, the test was pretty straightforward. One only needed to avoid the blast in the way Lex had, and burying yourself in the rock walls seemed like a solid idea. But the reality of the situation was far more complex than that. This lava was far from ordinary, or rather it would be more accurate to say that the fire which resulted in this lava was unique. It could burn spirit energy directly, which was an almost unheard of ability at any but the highest levels. While Lex felt that the greatest threat was the eruption, the heat and the pressure, anyone else would have been continuously pelted by the radiation of the hot spirit energy produced by that flame. It would have worn them down, torn through their defenses, and killed them or brought them as near death as they could during a test. Lex, instead, only felt a minor irritation from it. Even though he had left regal embrace behind, making his body unreasonably resilient was a habit he could not break. His new cultivation technique continuously evolving him, while his bond, giving him the status of a planet, almost directly molded a path for him. Soon, if he continued on like this, his body would be as tough and resilient as a real planet, and his golden core would be like the core of the planet as well. Even after being ejected, Lex continued his cultivation for a few hours to allow his body to stabilize. When he opened his eyes, he felt both extremely powerful and famished. When he opened his eyes, he saw Mateo standing in front of him alongside a new projection, a mature-looking woman whose gaze was like a window through time. Lex felt a subtle pressure on him just from being the subject of that gaze, though he could not understand it. The pressure did not seem physical, nor was it pressing down on his soul. Was it psychological? "You have secrets in your body," the temple did not initially detect, the woman finally said, her tone neutral yet firm. She was not asking, but stating. "The inscriptions, especially, are very interesting. Only someone with an exceptional understanding of the human body and soul could have come up with them. I see you have tried to remove them. It is not necessary. Instead, once you cross the threshold of immortality, the features of the inscriptions will become a part of you. I've heard one of them is a tracker. I don't want that at all. Besides, I've been told that they will pollute me if I don't remove them." Yes, at a glance it does seem like they will pollute you. But those with a deeper understanding of the human body, and the human cultivation path, can determine that it is not pollution. Instead, it will guide your growth. The reason your empyrean physique could be detected by the temple at all is because you've already reduced the potency of the inscriptions. Otherwise, your physique would have stayed suppressed and hidden. Even the tracking serves a good purpose. Once you grow, it will naturally turn into anti-tracking. Whoever designed these inscriptions was a genius. Were it another age, they would have been invited to the temple for training and guidance. But that is not why we are here. Instead, we are here to address the issue of your guidance. Upon seeing the hodgepodge manner of your cultivation, Mateo aptly consulted someone more qualified to guide you. "Young man, reviewing your scan results, as well as observing you up close, gives me a distinct impression. Your cultivation is like a perpetual stew. Like the ancient ancestors of our race, you continuously add everything to the same pot and continue to blend it together, resulting in a hearty and potent stew. But we are more advanced than that now, and don't need to rely on such methods. Your potential is enormous, and I would like to help you uncover it. With your permission, I would like to take you on as a student, and teach you properly." Lex, who was unprepared for such an invitation, quickly considered the woman's words. The information she had given him was conflicting with everything he had learned so far, and he had no real reason to believe she was right while everyone else he had met was wrong. Moreover, he did not know her identity, background or qualification. He also suspected the act of becoming her student contained some ceremonial significance. So why then did he feel such a strong sensation of trust towards her? It was the same feeling he had towards Mateo, only stronger this time. It was as if something deep inside of him recognized the temple as a safe space, and did not allow him to raise his guard. Still, he could not dismiss caution based on a feeling. "Who are you? What can you teach me? What will happen if I become your student?" Lex asked as he threw on his clothes. He had stripped before cultivating, since he did not want his clothes to burn in the lava. Caught up in his cultivation, he had not had a chance to put clothes back on this entire time. He could not decide if he should feel ashamed for mooning, or the projections should be accused of being perverts. "My name is Cassandra Van Zagnew, and I am one of the oldest and strongest living humans in the universe today. Besides that, I cannot tell you much more, as much of my history is linked with secrets of the temple that are not fit to be revealed yet. Becoming my student, at least in the way we are doing things right now, does not hold much more relevance than to establish a relationship based on respect and a desire to teach and learn. If you ever have the opportunity to present yourself before my actual self, there will be an opportunity for something more. Chapter 906, Get Some Rest. Lex used his sixth sense, his instincts, and his own better judgment all to determine the veracity of what Cassandra was saying. According to his own judgment, Cassandra did not seem like she wanted something from Lex, or wanted to set him up for something. Instead, her entire being reeked of objective neutrality. If Lex were really forced to assign an emotion to describe what she may be feeling, it might be akin to the feeling of a skillful jeweler upon discovering a unique gem, wanting to ensure the gem was polished and attached to a work that will make it shine like it deserves. Ultimately, Lex could not detect any reason to doubt her, and the feeling emanating from deep inside of himself won. He stood respectfully in front of her and bowed slightly. "Please teach me," Lex said humbly. Since he had become the innkeeper, he hardly ever imagined himself lowering himself before someone else. But in this instance, where the other was much more learned than him and was guiding him, Lex did not feel any resistance or hesitation in bowing. Cassandra showed the barest hint of a smirk before returning to her neutral expression. "Before we begin your cultivation or training, we must establish a routine for you. I can see that your body has shrunk to that of a baby's size. Originally my suspicion was that this was a result of an energy deficiency in your body and that once your energy was replenished, you would grow back. But upon further analysis, I can see that in healing, your body truly has returned to an infantile state. Even the world's dumbest parent will know that babies need sleep and rest. Although your needs are not exactly the same, not following your body's needs creates a less than optimal result. Before you do anything else, you need to understand your body. It is what you will use your entire life, so the better you understand it and care for it, the better it will support you. For the duration of your stay at the temple, I will take care of your routine and nutrition. For the next 3 days, you must only sleep, eat and rest. Although you feel strong, babies should not be overly exerted. Once your condition returns to your peak after 3 days, we will begin your training. Be aware that once your training begins, it will be excruciating. To avoid any accidents, you will only be trained for a total of 1 month before you are led to deal with the deity. Mentally prepare yourself." Cassandra turned around and indicated that Lex should follow as she led him towards his new bedroom. Lex felt slightly hesitant. Was it really okay for him to be napping around? But then again, Cassandra had been able to dissect the nature of his inscriptions just as a projection, and apparently saw much more than anyone else. If she said his body needed him to sleep, she was probably right. With a shrug, he followed along until eventually he was brought to a strange, oval pod that opened up to reveal a bed submerged in water. The first thought Lex had was that this was a sensory deprivation pod, but that did not seem exactly right. Ads by Pub Future. While you sleep, your body will be gently massaged by the bed. The liquid inside is a special healing solution which will not only bring your body to its peak, it will boost your body's ability to heal for the next few weeks. For the next month, you will be sleeping in this. It will help you recover fully after each training session, and be prepared for the next day. Now get some rest. When you wake up, I'll have a meal ready for you. Afterwards are a series of light exercises to gently stimulate your body without exerting it. Intrigued, Lex stepped into the pod. The liquid was warm and smelled quite soothing and pleasant. He could not help but relax and close his eyes so that he could focus more on the smell. It felt so comfortable, he could not help but lie back down and allow half his body to be submerged in the liquid. It covered his ears, but left the remainder of his face above the liquid, so that he had no problem sleeping. The pod closed, though a dim, warm light filled the inside of the pod, not that Lex noticed. His attention was on the bed that was gently vibrating and moving under his body. Parts of it would protrude out in small spherical shapes, and move around underneath him, massaging his back. It was physically impossible to resist the sigh of relief that escaped Lex's mouth, moments before he fell into a deep, restful sleep. His muscles relaxed, his mind let go of his worries and his soul allowed itself to simply float in its container. When he woke up, he felt as if he had entered the pod for only a few seconds, but the difference he felt from his body was tremendous. He woke up feeling extremely fresh and without an ounce of drowsiness, so he got up and pushed open the pod. He looked around and was surprised to see an entire feast waiting for him on a table right outside his pod. He jumped out, feeling like he had thoroughly acclimated to his new tiny body, and much stronger than he had been when he entered. It was not just strength that bewildered him. Instead, his body felt so comfortable that he did not know how to describe it. Still in somewhat of a daze, he grabbed a fruit that was laid out for him and took a bite. His pupils expanded as the fruit gushed out a sweet, pulpy juice staining his baby face and overwhelming his senses with sweetness. Lex could not help but lick his lips as he glared at the fruit with some greed. In the duration of time it took for him to take a single bite, he completely forgot everything he was thinking before. Now, he was focused entirely on the food. Opening up his mouth as wide as possible, he buried his face in the fruit. Chapter 907 A Stroll. Lex could not help but groan as he looked at the ceiling, a food coma on the verge of descending. Since he had begun body cultivation, he rarely ever felt full, let alone on the verge of overeating. But at the moment, his condition was worse than if he had been attacked by 100 enemies. He felt a couple 1,000 pounds of weight inside his stomach, and it was difficult to even raise his head let alone move his body. His drool slid out of his open mouth and down his juice-stained cheeks. Had food always tasted that good? He could not remember, because even his brain was lagging under the weight of the amount he had eaten. Cassandra appeared beside him, holding a familiar clipboard, and was making some notes. "It seems I overestimated your stomach capacity by 3%, she said out loud, so that Lex could be informed of what was going on with him. "But that's fine, I will make adjustments along the way. The next few days of rest that you will be taking will also allow me to refine the effectiveness of your training plan to a millionth decimal place as I study your body. Some of the food that you consumed is actually supposed to be quite poisonous for humans," she commented, her voice never veering out of her neutral tone. "However, that is not the case for you. In fact, some of the foods you ate are also quite bitter and unpalatable for most people. But the reason it all tasted quite amazing to you is because those are exactly what your body needs. Cultivation does not magically just create matter. Even as a cultivator, your body needs numerous minerals and vitamins. In fact, you need even more than when you were a mortal. Since I have never seen your body prior to its recreation, I cannot comment on it, but I assume that you never had a proper rest and nutrition plan, and just assumed plain cultivation will take care of everything for you. You do not need to feel ashamed for not doing it. This is a common misconception, one that we regularly correct at the temple. It's ironic that the temple of fasting often focuses on feeding people. That's because 99.99% of those who enter the temple are not qualified to use the fasting feature of the temple. You are also not qualified yet. But pay no mind to that. I will now assign you some light exercise to help with digestion, as well as some herbal tea which will put you in the right psychological and physiological state for your next sleeping cycle. Follow me." Lex wanted to groan once again, but he could not bring himself to do it with someone else watching. He had never felt so gluttonous in his life, but he could not deny that it felt good. "Where are you getting all these foods from? Can I get some seeds to plant? It will help me tremendously if I can continue to maintain a healthy diet after leaving the temple," he stated. For the past few days, he hadn't really talked to Mateo, and now Cassandra, outside of talking about training. It wouldn't hurt to get to know them better, especially since Cassandra was supposed to be one of the strongest humans. The temple has a vast storeroom, beyond your imagination. Although we are using our resources on you freely, it mostly considered paying you in advance for taking your help in removing the deity. As such, while it is not a problem to use them on you, we cannot give you seeds, saplings, or other aid. That is because while nurturing humans is a part of the temple's mandate, it is restricted to only their being and not their material wealth. Well, Lex's hopes of boosting the inn using the temple were quashed, but he did not feel too disappointed. The inn was doing excellent, and he did not believe he needed any hand-holding on that front. If the temple's mandate is nurturing humans, can I bring in other humans for training if I do it without exposing its location? Previously, the temple opened its doors because it had already been exposed, as well as due to the unique connection your companion had with the temple. Do not expect it to do so again. But if you do, somehow, manage to bring in more humans, the temple will perform its function and train them. Lex nodded. The connection between the temple and the inn had not formed yet, despite him using the token so long ago. But since he would be here for at least another month, he was not too concerned yet. Moreover, it made sense that it was not easy to connect to something as mysterious and secretive as the temple. But for Lex's purposes, the temple was absolutely perfect. He had been thinking about how to train his workers for a long time. He did not want to have them enroll in Ventura, and finding skilled and knowledgeable teachers was not exactly easy. He had been making do with some manuals from the Emporium and using his more high-leveled workers as teachers, but now he would not have to. Here, this will be simple enough. I want you to walk along this path all the way to the end. That's all you have to do for now. Take as much time as you need, and go at whatever pace suits you, said Cassandra as she approached a new door. Intrigued, Lex approached and looked inside, and was surprised by what he discovered. He understood that he was supposed to be taking it easy, and that his body required rest. In fact, considering how amazing he felt after listening to Cassandra, he believed she was absolutely correct. Still, did he really have to stroll through an endless sea of flowers, covering rolling hills that seemed to stretch out into the horizon? Chapter 908 All for the Mission. Lex studied the scene before him, but no matter how he stared, he could see no underlying secret waiting for him to discover. There were no hidden laws that his eye detected and no boon that was awaiting his presence to descend. He turned to look at Cassandra questioningly, but her projection had already disappeared. Without anyone to question, Lex could only shrug and begin his walk. At first it took some effort, because he was feeling incredibly stuffed. Although the food was delicious, and his body was sending him waves of pleasure and gratification and the nutrition he had sent its way, even his highly advanced digestion could not instantly absorb the food that he had eaten. If Lex had to guess, then everything he ate was probably very powerful and rare, probably meant for beings at a higher cultivation than him. But as he strolled through the field of flowers, where most of the flowers seemed to be taller than him, he felt a little better. His body did not suddenly digest the food, but the pleasant smell carried by the gentle breeze caused him to relax, and allowed his mind to loosen. Before he knew it, he spread his arms out to gently touch the flower stalks as he passed by. He fell into a relaxed, meditative state where he had no thoughts other than to simply enjoy his current state. He path, although exceptionally long, did not provide him with any obstacles. Even its length, which, at a glance, appeared abundant, seemed insufficient under Lex's pace. In a completely relaxed state, Lex walked at what was a leisurely pace for himself. But even with his short legs, the strength he contained in each stubby leg was overwhelming, causing to shoot from one hill to the next with each step. He did not take note of how long he took to pass through the field, but the time felt just right. It was an enjoyable experience, but it did not bore him. He had also finished digesting all the food he had eaten, so he no longer felt uncomfortable and stuffed. Without needing to be led, Lex walked back to his sleeping pod and entered on his own. He was on a mission to kill Ra's clone as soon as possible, but this was by far the best mission he had ever undertaken. Should get one of these pods for the inn, Lex murmured right before falling asleep in the warm, caressing embrace of the very stated pod. In his sleep, Lex became slightly tense as he felt the approach of some unusual dreams, but before their arrival something blocked them out, and Lex relaxed. The next day, he woke up feeling even stronger than yesterday. He did not think it was possible that some sleep and food could increase his strength, but that's exactly what was happening. Outside the pod, like yesterday, a feast awaited him. This time, it was not made up entirely of various fruits, but was more mixed. There were many unfamiliar vegetables, and though Lex did not recognize what animals they came from, Lex noticed various barbecue items, roasts, steamed and pulled meat and more. But the one item on the feast that he did recognize was potato, in all its various forms. There was mashed potatoes, baked potato, French fries, curly fries, some kind of potato sauce, figurines carved out of cooked potatoes and more. Lex gulped as he prepared himself for the battle in front of him. Although yesterday, Cassandra had said she overestimated his capacity, today there seemed to be even more food. Before Lex could unleash devastation on this particular battlefield, his resolution to embrace death before dishonor held strongly in his heart. His new favorite teacher appeared beside his pod. According to some scans that were monitoring you during your sleep, you encountered an unusual situation in your sleep. A deeper analysis of the situation revealed sleep-induced prophecy, a state many oracles accidentally achieve when they are extremely relaxed. The temple blocks out all kinds of divination, so the prophecy was automatically blocked. The reason I am informing you is because today I will add a small lesson to your exercise session. You need to learn to control this particular phenomenon, and prevent it from happening again. These prophecies will be a great drain on you, regardless of whatever cultivation level you reach. As you grow stronger, the prophecies will also strengthen, thereby creating a vicious loop where you will always be too weak to support the consumption of these visions. This is very important because certain entities can detect the laws associated with prophecies, and influence them to send you wrong information. The deity, as well as the curse trapped within the temple, are both entities which can influence you through these channels. Not a problem, I am a quick learner, Lex assured her. Although his body was already urging him to attack the food, he had enough self-restraint to control himself when it came to important matters. Almost as if she was purposefully checking how he would react, given the stimuli of the food, and the urgency of the information she brought, Cassandra picked up the clipboard and began taking notes. You can eat. I will see you after you are done. She disappeared, leaving Lex to single-handed face the perils of an all-you-can-eat buffet. He took in a deep breath before launching himself at the nearest dish. His body was screaming at him, as if he had been hungry for 100 years and finally encountered some food. He did not question it, but just ripped out a big chunk of meat from what looked like a drumstick that was larger than his face. Spicy, he screamed internally, even as tears began to drip out of his eyes. But he did not stop, or even slow down for that matter. He loved spicy food. Even if he didn't, he would make the sacrifice and eat it all. It was all for the mission. Chapter 909 A Swim. With all his might Lex slammed down the final pudding cup and let out a satisfying burp, a massive chocolate-covered grin painting his face. When was the last time he had burped? He couldn't even recall, as that was not the kind of thing one usually took note of, but he was sure it had been over a couple of years. But as satisfied as he was, the meal was not over yet. Yesterday, he missed out on his herbal tea, so today it was delivered in advance, before he went out for a walk. But, more important than that, there was one item remaining that would end the meal properly. Although filled with a hint of excitement and anticipation, Lex controlled himself and sat cross-legged as he drank his tea. He imagined himself the protagonist in a kung fu movie as he picked up the small bowl with steam rising out from it. The taste was refreshing, but had a mild, bitter aftertaste that lingered for a few moments. Normally Lex would not appreciate the bitter taste, but after experiencing such a rich palate from all the food he had, it felt kind of nice. It was as if his taste buds were being cleansed. He took his time with the tea, and in fact spent some time meditating afterwards once he was done. He did not feel stuffed like he had yesterday, which was curious, because he ate more food today. Either the quality of the food was not the same, which Lex highly doubted, or his own capacity had increased today. Either way, when Lex opened his eyes, he saw the last item for him today. To complete his meal, all that was left was a single cigar. Normally, Lex would refrain from smoking a cigar right after a big meal, not that he smoked many, anyway. But today, since he was given the cigar by Cassandra, he would oblige. After all, as a student, he had to listen to his teacher. With a gentle touch, he picked up the cigar and examined it. its deep mahogany hue hinting at the unparalleled craftsmanship that went into making it. He carefully unwrapped the packaging, revealing the prize hidden within. He ran his finger across the length of the cigar, feeling its texture under his skin, before running it under his nose to take a whiff. Even non-smokers had to agree that cigars smelled great. Once he was done appreciating it, he cut the cap in a neat, clean slice and used the accompanying matchbox to light a flame and caress the cigar with it. A connoisseur would know not to use a lighter for such things, and as someone who had seen the movie Hellboy, he too had gained this sacred knowledge. As wisps of fragrant smoke began to unfurl, he embraced the moment, a symphony of senses intertwining in anticipation of the unparalleled journey that lay ahead. As he took in his first draw, Lex felt extraordinarily indulgent. The complicated flavors, the rich notes of aged leather and toasted oak, the exotic spices, and elusive hints of sweetness all delivered an unforgettable experience. Lex opened his eyes and got ready for the next pull, only to find that the cigar in his hands had already turned to ash. Well, what just happened? Lex could not help but ask, startled. That particular blend was too strong for you, said Cassandra, her projection having appeared beside him at some unknown time. You spent the last 3 hours processing your first puff. But it's not a waste even if you only took one puff. The purpose of this cigar is actually to evaporate some of your cultivation, and push it back down a bit, thereby making your foundation stronger. Taking too much of it, at your level, would have done you more harm than good. As it is, right now, you have received as much benefit from it as you can. Your cultivation, which was growing a little too rapidly, has been tempered off. This way, your cultivation will rise when we want it to, not at every random opportunity. Now come on, follow me. Today, instead of a stroll, you'll be going for a light swim. At the same time, I will brief you on the technique to avoid divination in your sleep. Cassandra began her instruction right then and there, even as she led him towards a different part of the temple. The technique had 2 parts, one active and one passive. He would first learn the active part, and use it before he slept every time he slept. Meanwhile, he would study the passive part and take his time comprehending it. The essence of the technique was to have firm control over his various abilities, so that they would not randomly activate when he was asleep. In practice, it was a little more complicated, but for some reason, Lex kept imagining that he was being taught the cultivation version of not wetting the bed. The embarrassment from the thought alone was enough to motivate him to take the technique absolutely seriously. The reason why he was asked to practice the technique while he swam was so that he could practice his control over his abilities in an unfamiliar environment. The technique was not overly complicated for someone who had repeatedly strengthened their mind, so he was able to understand the underlying concept fairly easily. Now all he had to do was practice while he swam. Just like the field of flowers yesterday, his designated spot for swimming was fantastic. It was extremely scenic, and the cool, refreshing water was filled with colorful and interesting little fish who swam all around him. None of them were aggressive, and most of them were friendly enough to come and observe him as he swam past their homes. By the end, Lex was feeling light-hearted and easy, as if he had let go of some stress he was unconsciously carrying with him. Knowing that what awaited him now was a good night's sleep, he could not help but smile. Training should always be this relaxing. Somewhere in the distance, Cassandra was observing him carefully, putting the final touches to the hellish training that awaited him. Chapter 9-10 The Door. When Lex returned to the pod, he noticed a small change in the setup. Now, instead of a warm liquid, the pod was filled with sand. He was hesitant at first to get in, only imagining how difficult his life would be once he got sand in his hair and clothes, but then he recalled that he barely had any hair. Moreover, his clothes were self-cleaning. Ignoring the bitterness in his heart, Lex climbed into the pod and made himself comfortable. Like the liquid, the sand was warm. But it was not rough and coarse or irritating, and it did not get everywhere. Instead, it was soft and welcoming. Feeling the embrace of sleeping approaching, Lex quickly used his newly learned technique to prevent him from using divination, and allowed himself to succumb. His eyes closed, and he fell asleep immediately, letting out a light, cute snore. Regardless of whether it was happenstance, or his technique was actually working, he had no dreams that night, and woke up the next day feeling refreshed and buried. At some point, his body had submerged into the sand, leaving only his face exposed. But he did not feel uncomfortable, and emerging from the sand proved an easy task. He pushed open the pod to find yet another feast waiting for him. This time, the food carried an intimidating aura, as if made from the flesh of terrifyingly strong beasts. That did not stop Lex at all, though he admitted that he had a tough time eating it due to his teeth not yet fully emerging from his gums. The meat was tough and chewy, but to make up for that fact, it was packed full of flavor, and each time he chewed, it gushed out amazing juices. The fruits were wrapped in shells that were difficult for him to break, even with his strength, though some ingenuity resolved any issues he had. If the previous 2 meals were meant to spoil him, then this meal was clearly waiting to be earned by him. Nothing was easy to eat, and if he did not put in sufficient effort, it would not yield any rewards. But that did not deter him, nor did it slow him down. He summoned swords and daggers, and sliced when slicing was needed, and slammed when slamming was needed. Eating became a workout, but after a few continuous hours of effort, he finally ate everything on the table. Feeling both satisfied and somewhat exhausted, Lex looked up at the projection of Cassandra, who had appeared at some point. Today, you will train a bit with a pole staff, and then spend the rest of your time sunbathing. Tomorrow, the next phase of your training will officially begin. Lex nodded, and tried to strike up a conversation with her again, but Cassandra was not much of a talker. She gave him quick, one-word replies to any questions he asked, and didn't seem interested in his topics of conversation. Eventually, he had to give up as they finally reached the training center. Lex was given a wooden pole staff, and asked to mimic the actions of a projection that appeared before him. At first, it only swung the staff once, which Lex copied. Then it added one more movement, then another. After using a few moves in conjunction, the projection reset completely and started with a new set of movements. Lex did not need to think, he only needed to copy. It was simple enough until Lex made a startling realization. His movement with the staff seemed perfect. Whether it was his weight or stability, his positioning or his awareness of the angles that he swung in, everything was perfect. He even felt like he was on the verge of manifesting a pole staff intent. After so long of trying to master swordsmanship and failing, he nearly mastered the simple use of pole staff in one single session. Was that a reflection of his astounding learning ability, or the quality of the training at the temple? Before he could reach an answer, the training session ended. He was brought to another room, this time by Matteo, which was supposed to lead him to where he was supposed to sunbathe. But Lex could not help but notice another door he saw in passing. It was a simple, unassuming door, its humble presence whispering of a timeless charm if only one could actually notice it. He raised an eyebrow as he detected something strange and examined it in greater detail. It was made of oak, and looked like it had weathered through entire eons yet had not succumbed to time, retaining its graceful dignity. Matteo said something, but when Lex did not respond, he turned around and saw a scene that alarmed him greatly. But Lex noticed none of it. He was stepping closer to the door, his heartbeat gradually beating faster as he approached. The wood boasted a rich tapestry of grains, each etched line narrating a silent story of growth and endurance. Its surface was worn smooth by years of welcoming touch, offering a tactile invitation to curious fingertips, Lex's fingertips. He raised his hand, not reached for the knob, but to touch the door itself. This close, he could detect the faint scent emanating from its frame. The smell was somehow the smell of nostalgia itself. He could hear memories long forgotten, filled with joy and laughter, right on the other side of the door. To swing it open would be to open a portal to warmth and welcome, to sunlight and fresh air, to childhood days without worry or regret. Just as Lex's fingers were moments away from touching on the door, a velvet curtain was dropped on it, and Matteo suddenly appeared in front of Lex, finally catching his eye. "Forget that door," he said gravely. "That's a mistake. It was not supposed to be here. It is a forbidden curse let loose by an ancient cultivator named Scorp. No, never mind. The fact that it has appeared here means the condition of the temple is worse than we thought. We might need to speed up your training. Come, let's go. I'll inform Cassandra. Before Lex even had an opportunity to argue, the velvet disappeared, and along with it, the door. Ancient curse? Lex could not help but wonder. It did not feel like a curse to him. It felt more like love, trapped behind a wooden door. Or perhaps, it was the door itself. Chapter 9:11 How can this be called training? Countless thoughts swam through Lex's mind as he followed Mateo. The feelings of nostalgia did not last long, and Lex quickly realized how unusual the situation was for him to be caught up in such emotions. Influenced so easily. There was definitely more to the door than it seemed, and it was definitely not as happy or endearing as the emotions it evoked. But considering how this temple was filled to the brim with extraordinarily high-leveled items, it was no surprise that Lex should encounter one. The only thing worthy of note was that Mateo had mentioned that the door should not have appeared here, and its presence betrayed the fact that the temple was malfunctioning. Lex put his thoughts of the unusual door behind him as he entered the new room where he would be sunbathing. A single survey of the room revealed the fact that, unlike his previous two experiences, which were very relaxing, this room most likely had an ulterior motive. It looked like a simple beach, where there was a reclining chair spread out for him, as well as a pair of sunglasses. But the steam coming out of the sand each time a wave of water receded, and the unusual rippling of air akin to that above of a bonfire told Lex that the sunlight was a tad hot. Of course, to Lex it did not feel like anything other than a gentle warmth from the sunlight. He was reminded that besides allowing him to replenish his exhausted strength, the purpose of these few days was also so that Cassandra could study his limits thoroughly. Although Lex could not estimate the various metrics she was studying, that did not mean she was slacking on her job. Aware of the fact that his leisure time was bound to end soon, Lex stripped down to his undergarments and lay down on the chair, putting on the appropriately sized sunglasses to protect his eyes. Since he had a few hours to spare, and did not plan on napping before going to bed at night, Lex spent the next few hours practicing the anti-divination technique. By the time Mateo returned to escort him back, Lex felt somewhat more familiar with the technique, but was nowhere confident enough to use it passively. He could already tell that reaching such a level would take a long time. The sunbathing gave him no noticeable benefit, although he noticed that by now even the water was boiling and steam was rising from the sand all around him. Was it supposed to be really hot? Appears that after training in lava, he had a much higher tolerance to heat than before. That was already expected though. In his bedroom, he was once again faced with a pod full of sand. Already familiar with it, he did not hesitate to get it, use his anti-divination technique and then go to sleep. He was looking forward to his training the next day. When he woke up, Lex felt a noticeable difference. He did not feel stronger, but rather more comfortable in his own body. Moreover, he had a vague sense that he had barely slept a couple of hours, unlike the last few days where he was sleeping nearly 12 hours. When he exited, he found that Cassandra was waiting for him, though her gaze seemed to be fixed on her clipboard. From today onwards, your routine will change. Although you will still have to sleep and eat every day, the amount will be much less than the previous few days. I've also adjusted the intensity of your training. It seems that I originally underestimated your tenacity. Now that I know your body can tolerate a much harsher beating, I've condensed several individual lessons into single, more demanding lessons. Have your breakfast and let's go. Instead of a feast, what awaited him was a single bowl of porridge, a glass of milk and what looked like a protein bar. Lex couldn't deny the disappointment he felt after being spoiled the last few days, but he did not let them affect him. He hurriedly consumed his breakfast, not bothering to waste time savoring it. As much as he enjoyed good food, he currently felt impatient to see what kind of training awaited him. Once he was done, Cassandra led him wordlessly to their first training room. Usually Lex would have tried to strike up a conversation with her, but today he decided to let it go. For too long had he been waiting to see what the training of the temple really was. Compared to how grand the temple was, the first training room seemed unusually mundane. It was a square room with dark gray walls and barely any lighting. If not for his improved eyesight, Lex would practically be blind here. "Here, put this on," Cassandra said as she pointed to a gray, leather armband that was placed on a table in the corner. It looked ordinary, but as soon as Lex touched it, he felt a strange suffocating feeling as his access to all the spirit energy in his body was cut off. Startled, Lex nearly dropped the band, but he regained composure quick enough. He looked towards Cassandra, as if demanding an explanation. "Originally, I was planning to begin your training by helping you sense divine energy. Then there would have been a session to help you control divine energy while keeping it outside of your body. If you absorb divine energy, your cultivation technique will automatically convert it to your unique brand of energy stored within your core, which is why it is important to manipulate it outside of your body. After that, you would have begun amalgamating the external energy into your attack patterns. You already know how to boost and strengthen your weapons using your internal energy, but you can do the same with external energies as well. You can also already control external energies, because if you did not, you would not be able to use your spatial affinity so fluidly. After all, it requires manipulation of spatial energy. Considering your familiarity with the concepts, I anticipated that it would take you 3 to 4 days to learn all of this. But, considering your inhuman resilience, your ridiculous healing capabilities, and your amazing comprehension speed, we will do all of that today. By blocking off your control over the energy within your body, you will only be able to use external energy. This particular room is designed to filter all kinds of energies, allowing only a specified one inside. As such, I will flood the room with divine energy. Then I will give you a sword capable of enhancement via divine energy, and then put you up against a foe many times stronger than you, as well as more skilled than you in combat. Can you guess what happens next? You're right, it will be a fight to the death. Of course, should you fail, I'll stop before you really die, but don't doubt that I will fully allow you to get hurt very seriously. After all, at the temple, we can heal you and bring you back to a fighting state. But, do not worry. Leaving you to fight a far superior foe without guidance is not my style for this level of training, at least. Step-by-step instructions on how to deal with the foe will be transmitted directly to your brain. They will include 2 steps. The first step will be the physical maneuver, and the second step will be the divinity enhancement. If you manage the first and not the second, you will not be able to reproduce the desired effect, but you also won't die too quickly. Now, put on the band and take your sword. You can practice a little before we summon your opponent. How can you call this training? Lex asked in an exasperated way. Even Marlowe at least taught him some basic moves, and that fellow was unhinged. This is, of course, not your training, Cassandra responded, her voice and expression completely neutral. This is only the first step. Activating your sense of danger will push your brain into a hyper state, thereby speeding up your learning process. This is just so you can figure out how to control external energy faster. The actual training begins afterwards. I don't need the threat of death to do that, said Lex as he put on the armband and grabbed a long sword which magically appeared in the air in front of him. I can do that on my own. As if to explain to Cassandra what he meant, Lex entered his state of flow. A projection for a simple slash entered his mind, similar to the one had been practicing but never satisfied with, but with minute differences all the same. Moreover, there was a distinct moment right at the beginning of the move when the edges of the sword began to glow, giving off a soft, white light. Devoid of all emotion, Lex tried to replicate the move. Although the sword did not ultimately glow, Cassandra was able to detect a ripple in the divine energy within the room. A faint expression finally appeared within her usually neutral eyes. Chapter 9:12 From outside the syllabus. Since Lex was focusing on the instructions he was receiving in his mind, he did not notice the faint emotion which emerged in Cassandra's eyes. But since she did not make any additional changes to his training program, it did not seem to matter. He was repeating the moves as close to perfect as he could, and he felt himself improving with each swing. The reason why Lex always felt like his swordsmanship was lacking was because although the sword swing seemed fine, he was able to detect flaws in his body, or weight distribution, or something else. Sometimes, he did not even know what was wrong except that his instincts told him something was missing. Following the instruction in his mind made a monumental difference, though. Even the smallest change, such as the angle at which he turned his ankle while standing in a certain posture, made all the difference. It was the difference between a straight line drawn using a ruler and a straight line drawn by an artist. To the untrained eye, there may not be any difference, or the artist's work may even seem inferior. But someone who could comprehend the complexities involved would see that a straight line, when drawn by someone who had the potential to create a grand masterpiece, held infinite possibilities. While the same straight line, drawn alongside the edge of a ruler, only ever contained the possibility of being a straight line. The ruler could make nothing else. It was a level of comprehension into a subject that teetered on the edge of being measurable and quantifiable, and that of being abstract. In summary, the sword swing now had the potential to become anything Lex could need it to become. While Lex was making no progress on controlling divine energy, he could subtly feel his sword intent forming. He spun, following the instructions in his mind, and swung the sword backwards as if deflecting a silent blow that was coming from behind him. The swing was a perfect replica of the image in his mind, save the glowing edge. But the difference this time was that he actually did end up blocking an attack. But while his form was perfect, the strength of the attack was too great, and Lex was thrown off balance. The image in his mind changed, and Lex, in his emotionless state, followed without missing a step. But while he managed to block his leg from being amputated, the very fact that his sword was not reinforced by divine energy meant that it could not match up in strength. In his flow state, he immediately judged that it was possible to effectively deflect these blows using only skill, even with the difference in strength. It was just that the instructions he was receiving were not meant to do that, which is why he kept suffering. He shifted from his flow state to his overdrive state. The overdrive state lacked the finesse of the flow state, but it forced his brain to operate at a capacity much greater than normal. When he first unlocked this state, Lex discovered that its consumption was massive and that he couldn't keep it running indefinitely. But the energy reserves for his technique were so massive that he more or less hardly ever ran into an energy deficiency issue. When considering the kind of boost it provided Lex, it was almost like a cheat. Lex had been thrown to a side, and was lying on his back. He did not even have time to stand up, his mental guide already transmitting the next move to prevent himself from dying. Time seemed to slow down as his mind analyzed the next set of instructions, and through them deduced the kind of attack his opponent was making. He then calculated the difference between the amount of strength he could generate on his own, and that which would be generated if his sword were imbued with divine energy. It was an easy enough estimate to make once he had felt the difference in the outcome that his instructions predicted, and the one that his body suffered from. With that, he was able to deduce how much stronger the attacker was than himself. With all the information he had on hand, as well as the template of the movements from his instructions, his mind speculated on the best way to adjust for the difference in strength using technique only. Lex's eyes glowed as his overdrive state worked better than it had ever done before. He swung the sword, deviating from the instructions for the first time, and once again stimulating a reaction in Cassandra. She could tell exactly what the outcome was about to be, which is why she was surprised. Lex blocked the attacker, and instead of receiving the attack head-on, caused it to deviate, and hit the floor beside him. Completely unaffected by the previous attack, Lex finally got the time to leap onto his feet and observe his attacker. It was, predictably, a suit of armor, but this one was glowing, no doubt indicating that it contained divine energy. More instructions came, and Lex's mind quickly dissected them to repeat the process it had just undergone previously. It was not perfect, as there was only so much strength pure skill could account for, but it was enough to ensure that Lex was no longer being manhandled. When Lex successfully blocked 3 attacks without being flung across the room, the gleam in his eyes sharpened, and he changed his process once again. Instead of just dissecting his instruction so that he could figure out the best way to defend, he began figuring out ways in which he could attack. This time, when the change happened, Cassandra was no longer surprised, but did pick up her clipboard to make a note. Lex blocked the attack, or rather, touched his foe's sword with his own and gently guided the attack to the side. Meanwhile, he took a step forward, bringing himself closer to the suit of armor. At this distance, the armor could not react in time as Lex flourished his sword, bringing it back from deflection and turning it into a swift attack on its chest. There was not even a scratch on the suit of armor, but it did stumble. Lex's mind worked even faster as he absorbed this swordplay and made it his own, so that he could use it as he wished. 2 more times, Lex managed to deflect as well as attack, causing the suit or armor to stumble. The 3rd time, a silver tinge appeared around the sword and Lex felt something in the universe around him, responding to his attack. While his previous attacks could not even leave a mark on the suit of armor, this one caused a soft dent and a crack to form. Lex grinned and attacked again. The silver energy around his sword became more prominent and seemed to cause a sheen sound as it cut through the air. The suit of armor fell back, and for the first time, fell into a defensive position. Exhilarated, Lex attacked again and again, refining the silver energy further, causing it to become a thick yet sharp layer around the edge of his sword. This was not the divine energy he was supposed to master, but it was the sword intent that Lex had long wanted to master. With each swing his intent became sharper and more deadly, and the laws around him responded to as well. Even though this room had filtered all types of energy out, and left only divine energy inside, it could not filter out laws. Lex's sword intent was directly a result of the sword laws, or sword Tao, resonating with his skill and will, and it could not be stopped from manifesting. Lex continued to attack, till there came a point that the sword intent became almost solid, and nearly indistinguishable from the actual sword itself. He could feel that he had already encountered the first roadblock in his path, and if he surpassed it, his sword intent would move to the next level. Instructions entered Lex's mind, as they had been this entire time, but for the first time, Lex decided to ignore them completely. He could see a better way of attacking. He could see a vulnerability in his enemy, though he could not tell if it was natural or by design. Regardless, Lex chose to believe in himself rather than the images in his mind. He could also feel that this was the key to breaking through the first shackle in his sword intent. Letting loose a simple war cry, Lex swung his sword diagonally at full strength, even though the enemy was some distance away. His sword fell short. But his sword intent, which had thoroughly latched onto the edge of his blade, came loose and flew across the room, turning into an ethereal sword flying through the air. It was too swift to block, and in one simple slice, cut the helmet in half. Chapter 9:13 Wounded. Lex's figure was frozen still, his gaze fixed on the headless armor. His mind was clear, devoid of any follow-up instructions, meaning that the fight was over. Sensing the threat abate, his overdrive state gradually disappeared, and an excited grin appeared on Lex's face. He had been struggling with sword intent for so long, who could have guessed it would come so quickly and so easily? He even managed to overcome the first obstacle in growing the sword intent. It was still far from enough to absorb the intent hiding in his soul, but it was a good start. Moreover, Lex had overcome a far superior enemy using nothing but his own skills. It felt good. "Do you feel pleased with yourself?" Cassandra asked, her expression long returned to her normal, neutral state. Sensing the rhetoric nature of the question, Lex did not answer. "In a sense, I guess you really should feel gratified with your progress. Based on your experiences so far, combat usually takes the form of a series of exchanges with the objective to destroy the opponent's spirit, soul, or body. Considering your soul-forged physique, the elevated defenses of your soul and spirit allow you to focus on the seemingly easier option of physical combat. Based on this premise, learning sword intent is more useful than learning to manipulate energy externally. But when facing an opponent much stronger than yourself, where the odds have not forcefully been skewed in your favor, every single bit of advantage you have can bring you closer to survival if not victory. Let me show you what you can expect to face in an opponent of the same caliber, but without the handicap of only attacking physically. Take off your band, I want you to fight at full strength." Cassandra's words distinctly lacked the element of admonishment, but even so it was clear that she was unhappy with the fact that he had focused on sword intent rather than divinity. Now, instead of just instructing him, she wanted him to see for himself why she was guiding him on a specific path. Lex removed his armband and got into position, instantly entering the state of flow. He expected that this fight would be much more difficult than the previous one. The suit of armor, which had previously frozen upon decapitation, stood up straight. A bright light shone above its torso, and the helmet, which had been cleaved in half, reappeared and began to mend itself. Lex's grip on his sword tightened. If one were to consider the suit of armor as a human, then he had effectively just brought himself back to life. Besides Lex, who had survived without a head due to the unique feature of his body, soul, and spirit being combined into one, he had never seen anyone else accomplish the same feat. Although the suit of armor did not move, he saw a strange fluctuation in laws around it with his left eye. Before he could analyze what the opponent was doing, he was hit with a strong sense of vertigo, and lost control of his body. His mind, which should have been focusing on finding a solution to his state, became occupied with an unusual sense of guilt that was weighing him down. Every sin he had ever done, from lying to his parents, stealing his sister's dessert, stepping on a line of ants he had not seen, hurt someone's feeling without realizing, to things like killing his enemies, prioritizing his loved ones over others, abandoning Earth, ignoring the plight of humans in the many worlds he had visited, and many, many more suddenly came to life in his mind and assaulted his very being. His every virtuous deed, from helping Little Blue, befriending his workers, taking care of his guests, spending time with someone who felt lonely, and many more, all came to life and began to devour his sense of self, trying to turn him into a saint whose only purpose for existing was doing good deeds. Perhaps if he had been given enough time, he could reorient himself. But the matter of fact was, he hadn't been. In a fraction of a second, just as his body began to fall but even his knees had not yet touched the floor, the armor appeared before him, and impaled his chest with its sword. The sharp pain of a sword cutting through muscle and bone rocked his mind, but that did not wake him from the deluge of bizarre spirit attacks he was suffering, but instead only made him more vulnerable. There was another piercing pain, this time in his neck, and he felt that his head had almost been removed from his body. His consciousness began to fade, his mind still reeling. His state of flow had been broken long ago, and Lex could do nothing to respond, or so it seemed. Domination erupted from his body like a volcano, launching the suit of armor away from himself like it had been physically hit by its force. All the visions in his mind cleared, his emotions stabilized, his sins and virtues disappeared, replaced instead with the image of himself standing stalwart under the endless assault, even bloodied and battered as he was. The enemy's sword was in his hand, he had grabbed it at the last second before it pierced his eye, his tremendous strength keeping it from inching forward or back. Ads by Pub Future. His aura did not suffer any harm due to his bloodied state, instead it became stronger. A stronger, more fierce, and more noble aura enveloped him, pushing back against the halo of divinity that surrounded the suit of armor. He was ready to continue the fight, his strength undiminished even in his injured state, but such a display was enough for Cassandra to get her point across. That is just one of the abilities common to all deities, once they reach a sufficient level. It is not without reason that deities are worshipped, and treated above all other beings. The powers they gain are a blend of the many inherent qualities of divine energy, as well as the domain of their belief. Their more potent abilities all have to do with their belief. You can combat it like you have done now, using a type of brute force to push them back. But there are better ways. Why fight a bitter fight, when you can win without drawing a drop of blood from yourself? It was slightly difficult to calm down when your body was in so much pain and you were all geared up for a fight, but Lex managed. Unfortunately, he was no stranger to pain, but the benefit of that was that he found it easier to ignore. He also understood what Cassandra was saying. Much in the way that he used pure technique and skill to overcome his stronger foe in the sword fight, having more skills and abilities at his disposal would allow him to use techniques to navigate out of trickier situations against more versatile enemies. It was not as if he was going against Cassandra specifically. It was just that, in his flow state, he had judged that victory would be more easily attained through improving his swordsmanship. That was because he misunderstood the necessary parameters for victory. He would only win when he mastered external divinity manipulation, not when he defeated his foe. I understand. I am ready to try again, he said, ignoring the gaping hole in his chest, right beside his heart, and the one in his neck. No, not like this. Wait. Since you've already felt some of the abilities divine energy affords, you might as well experience some more. The suit of armor, which had only a short while ago attacked him with the intention to kill, raised his hand and projected out a bright, white light which fell onto Lex's body. His wounds began to itch, but the discomfort lasted only a moment. A warmth filled his chest, and traveled through his body to the wounds which began to heal rapidly. In a matter of minutes, both his injuries vanished, his dried blood and torn clothes the only proof that he had ever been hurt at all. He felt slightly drained physically, but it was barely noticeable. This was extremely useful. Now try once again. This time, focus on the divinity. You have 3 hours, after which we will move on to the next step regardless of whether you've learnt or not. Trust me, you'll wish you had learnt external control at that point. In truth, Cassandra had originally given him the whole day to learn, but once she saw his flow state, she changed his training outline once again. She could tell why Matteo had been so frustrated. But instead of feeling frustrated, she felt gratified. A student who learned well would make the teacher want to teach even more. She wanted to see how much he could grow before their time was up. Chapter 9:14 Sword Hammer. Lex touched his neck, and was fairly impressed upon feeling the supple, fresh skin that he had since becoming a baby. Divinity was very useful, he had to admit. Originally, he had a negative impression of it considering the fact that it could so easily corrupt him. As someone with a lot of power in his hands, and a trigger-happy sword in his soul, he was not particularly fond of anything that would influence his psyche. But if he could learn to wield divinity properly, and he could heal as effectively as the suit of armor had, then it was absolutely worth the risk. Re-entering the state of overdrive, Lex fixed his gaze on the suit of armor and readied himself for the instructions to once again land in his mind. Their fight resumed, and a familiar scene of Lex being overwhelmed once again played out. But this time, Lex was not so focused on defending himself, which unfortunately resulted in him sustaining more injuries. Instead, his focus was entirely on the additional glow on the sword that appeared in his instructions. Upon observing them with scrutiny, Lex discovered that besides the physical components of the movements required, the instructions also detailed how exactly it was manipulating the energy to augment the sword. To do that, Lex would first have to learn to sense divine energy, subsequently learn how to control it externally, and then follow along. But controlling energy outside of his body was harder than it seemed. When he was doing it subconsciously, such as with spatial energy, apparently, it was easy. But if he wanted to do it consciously, it bordered on impossible. If he could manage to do it successfully even once, and knew what it felt like, he could replicate it easily. But since he hadn't, with divine energy at least, he had to go through this arduous training. In a way, this training almost seemed unfair. After all, Lex had not been taught the basics of external energy control at all before being instructed to do it mid-combat. But the numerous hints he was picking up from his instructions kept his mind occupied, so that his thought process never went that way. Besides, with all the advantages he had in almost everything that he did, he was not someone who could complain about fairness. Little by little, as time went by, even as he sustained numerous injuries and once again became covered in his own blood, he began to grasp the minute details of external control. Without overdrive it would have taken him much longer, and if he hadn't mastered sword intent, he would not have survived the onslaught for so long. It was as if he barely and narrowly managed to gain something from this training session, but that is not how Cassandra saw it. In her eyes, the fact that Lex seemed to only barely gain something was a facade. Even if he had been pushed harder, the outcome would have been exactly the same, where he would have used a combination of some other abilities to just narrowly get by. This was both proof that Lex had never trained properly in his abilities, and so did not know how to extract the most benefit from them, and that she was not pushing him nearly as hard as she thought. A soft breeze seemed to fill the room, but it was one that could only be felt by those sensitive to divine energy. Lex figured out something interesting. His perception of control was incorrect in this situation. He had imagined controlling and manipulating external energy with the fluidity and expertise that he controlled his internal energy, but that was not what he needed to do. Instead, he merely needed to guide the energy, and allow it to behave according to its own nature to naturally empower him and augment his weapon. Cassandra's example of the technique the armor could use was slightly misleading, as he was not yet at the level where he could do that. For now, he only needed to focus on mimicking the extent to which his figure in his instructions controlled the energy. As his sword swung through the air, coated in a thin layer of sword intent, the divine energy in the room seemed to follow its trail, as if he had cleaved a path for it to flow. It was a good first step, but not quite what he needed to do. He needed the energy to latch onto his sword as he cleaved through it, not follow along. But since he had finally taken the first step, the second step was inevitable. But Lex felt impatient. Now that he saw the path to victory, his stalwart heart, which had resigned to suffering whilst he made progress, was no longer willing to suffer so needlessly. Lex deviated from his instructions a bit to push away the suit of armor and give himself a few moments to prepare. He gripped his massive sword with both hands and blasted his domination in full. He wanted to see if he could force the energy to behave a certain way. That way, he would skip to the part where he could experience what it felt like, and just directly replicate that in the future. He visualized the result he wanted, doing his best to perfectly replicate all the subtle nuances exhibited by the figure in his instructions, and swung his sword, this time attacking the suit of armor instead of defending. The sword seemed to glow, though that glow faded long before the sword itself struck the suit of armor, and hence the augmentation did not have an effect. Lex did not let up and continued to bash the suit of armor. A small, teeny-tiny part of him may just be venting his frustration at the armor. He had more or less been the indestructible one due to his astounding defense. Since when had he suffered so much and shed so much blood in a single session? As Lex continued to bash the armor, using his sword more like a hammer than anything else, the glow on the sword began to last longer and longer. Finally, there came a point when the sword was still glowing when it struck the armor. Lex honed in on that feeling, and quickly dropped his domination. He had no idea if domination had worked at all, to begin with, for influencing and intimidating energy was not in its description. But due to the nature of the technique, it served as an excellent tool to put Lex in the right frame of mind. Now, with an example to actually mimic, he no longer needed its aid. He transitioned from overdrive to flow, and began repeating the process effortlessly. He no longer focused on defeating the suit of armor, though that was not because he wanted it to survive longer so he could beat it more. No, the real reason he was taking his time was so that he could thoroughly master augmenting his sword. At the moment, he could do it for a few seconds each time, the interval varying randomly. But with Lex making so much progress, mastering the technique was only a matter of time. As it turned out, when that time came and Lex thoroughly mastered the technique, Cassandra automatically ended the session. There was an almost imperceptible feeling of disappointment hidden within Lex's eyes as he saw the suit of armor disappear, but Cassandra either did not notice or did not care to comment on it. "I gave you 3 hours to learn external manipulation. Do you know how long you took?" "I wasn't keeping track, but it couldn't have been too long," said Lex hesitantly, wondering if he had been too engulfed in beating the armor. "You took 1 hour and 32 minutes, Cassandra said. She did not state whether she was pleased with this time frame, or state how she felt about it at all. Instead, after pointing it out, she healed Lex once again using divine energy, and began to inform him of how his next class would proceed. Do not become reliant on divine energy to heal your body. Extensive use can cause mutations. For most people, those mutations are a welcome boost to their abilities. For you, it would be a drastic reduction in your potential. Although, I guess that's not something you should be concerned with anytime soon, as you'd have to learn the ability first. Now, we are moving on to the next part of your training. Since you can already control external divine energy, next you have to interrupt the flow of divine energy under someone else's control. You do not need to do anything specific, you just need to disrupt the flow. Their next class began immediately, without reprieve in the middle. Lex did not complain of exhaustion either, but that was a mistake he would soon regret. After all, if he never expressed dissatisfaction, Cassandra always assumed he could do more. Chapter 9:15 The Difference. Cassandra was not a strict teacher. She never forced Lex to do anything, nor did she yell or set stringent rules for Lex to adhere to. In each lesson, she would meticulously explain to Lex what his objective was, how that would benefit him, and how to go about it. No matter what lesson it was, Lex always discovered that she had given him exactly enough guidance for him to comprehend the topic. All that was needed was for him to put in the necessary effort. At the same time, there was not a single lesson she taught where Lex did not bleed. No matter how quickly he improved his swordsmanship, how he improved his sword intent, how adept he became at controlling divinity, or how he mastered space, he would always bleed. The absurdity of the situation was such that on the third day, Cassandra gave him a headband not to keep the sweat out of his eyes, but his blood. Each lesson was always extremely harsh, yet somehow within his capacity to tolerate. To top it all off, the perfectly selected menu each day, paired with the perfectly rejuvenating night's rest, always put him in the perfect state to continue training at the same barbarous level, if not at a higher one. At a certain point, Lex himself wanted to be mad, but the tremendous growth he was experiencing, as well as the amazing new mastery he was getting over his existing skills, alongside learning new ones, filled him with an unquenchable thirst for more. He was concerned that he may be turning into a masochist, but how could he care when he was finally learning how to teleport using only his own affinity? As per his request, his lessons were mostly focused on swordsmanship and the space element, alongside divinity, which was Cassandra's own requirement. He learned about sword intent, and how each stage had a cool-sounding name, which Cassandra thought was pointless, because Lex's level was too weak right now. Only when his sword intent passed through a few more stages, would it reach the average golden core level, which was not even enough to harm Lex. The only reason it seemed like his sword intent was giving a massive boost to his attacks was because of his tremendous strength to begin with, which benefited even from a tiny improvement. If he relied solely on sword intent, then he could not harm his own training clothes, let alone his enemies. Unfortunately, improving intent was nowhere as simple as it was to learn. Learning entailed bringing his swordsmanship to a level he himself thought was impeccable. This was because sword intent, or any kind of intent, as the name suggested, was strongly linked to the user's state of mind alongside sufficient mastery. After all, blatant competence with zero skill would not yield sword intent, as that would not result in any resonance with the affiliated laws. Improving your intent was directly linked to, and affected by, one's improvements and increased comprehension in the associated field. For example, if Lex wanted to increase his sword intent, he would need to attain a better understanding of swordsmanship, or learn significantly difficult sword techniques to improve. This understanding did not necessarily need to be about moves and techniques, but could be a philosophical one as well, such as when one should wield the sword, what does it mean, is it for fighting, killing, protecting, etc. Similarly, mastering a difficult technique was a way to quantify his improvement, and could thus translate into a direct improvement and better resonance with the law. While basic intents were common, to the point that most immortals are usually known to master dozens of, if not hundreds of basic intents, raising their levels was far from easy. The higher the level, the more abstract one's comprehension would have to be. But, subsequently, higher-level intents were also similarly more powerful. Nonetheless, Lex was still far from having to reach such a level for now. Although his improvements had slowed down from when he began, they were still steady. He was also making admirable progress in his control of divinity, so much so that his range for influencing divinity had reached 15 feet, 4.5 meters. At his level, this was already remarkable, and even Cassandra admitted that it would be very difficult for him to improve his control beyond this in the short term. But his greatest improvement was not in either divinity or swordsmanship, or even his cultivation, which reached the peak of the golden core realm. No, his greatest improvement was in his control of space. Cassandra informed him that beyond any affinity he had, he was most likely suited for controlling space because his comprehension of space was phenomenal. She said the most likely reason for this was that his mentally probably just suited the element. Lex had his own theory. He suspected that his time controlling space in incredibly complex ways in the Midnight Inn and Tavern translated into his own personal experience. He already knew what it felt like, so replicating the process was much easier than learning something he had no experience of. It was around the time that Lex mastered Blink, a very famous and popular space-based ability which allowed short-distance teleportation, that he had a random thought, and asked Cassandra about it. Is there some kind of space intent? No, intents are based on skills that you can learn naturally. Sometimes the line between what can and cannot have an intent is vague, but what is certain is that everything has a Tao. Learning an intent can help you on the road to mastering a Tao, but even without it you can gain mastery over a Tao. For example, I believe you have a strong affinity for the space Tao. What's the difference between a Tao and a law? Lex asked casually, most of his mind still focused on his training. Cassandra, on the other hand, did not treat this question as lightly. She looked at him for a moment, but then eventually shook her head and decided to give an extempore answer. A law merely outlines the behavior or effects of a Tao. A Tao, on the other hand, is all-encompassing. Chapter 9:16 Favoritism. With his focus otherwise occupied, Lex did not give too much consideration to Cassandra's answer, and just took it as she explained. In the few weeks that followed, Lex was often in such a state of mind, which was not an easy feat. Multitasking had become considerably easier for him with his elevated mental capacity, so for his training to occupy his entire capacity for focus was a testament to how difficult it really was. But while it lasted, for all the pain it caused him, Lex felt extremely gratified. He always felt like he was at a disadvantage, despite his many cheats, for never having experienced a formal education and training in the cultivation world. But now, that itch and, to some extent, insecurity, was finally addressed. But since Lex did not have anyone to compare with, he did not know how the quality of his education and training as compared to the norm. But since he had gained from it substantially, he was satisfied. About 4 days before his month was supposed to be officially over, Cassandra suddenly woke him in the dead of night. Sleeping cozily in his pod, now with a relatively normal pillow and blanket instead of water or sand, he was filled with reluctance to wake up. But, ultimately, he did not linger. Yet when he got out, he was surprised to see the solemn expression on the usually neutral face of his teacher. Considering only a few days were left for his training, he assumed that they were about to embark for an unusually difficult lesson, but that seemed not to be the case. There's a situation. You need to go and kill the deity as quickly as possible, we can no longer wait. What happened? The deity has somehow tapped into the energy network of the temple. If we give him too much time, not only will he become too powerful for you to face, but he could compromise the operation of the temple itself. There are many in the temple who are currently in dormancy. Should they awaken due to an issue in the temple, well, the deity will no longer be a problem, as he will surely be killed immediately. But the subsequent problems will be extremely grave. This goes for you as well. Whether you like it or not, you are now associated with the temple's karma. That means the enemies of the temple are your enemies, and that if they sense the temple and search for it, you too will be locked on. If that happens, with your level, unless someone of sufficient status is willing to hide you, there is nowhere in the universe you can escape. Lex was not treating this matter lightly to begin with, but being targeted by someone even this supposedly extremely amazing temple was hiding from was not something he could afford. Most of the time he could bluff and get away with stating that the Innkeeper was at a Tao Lord level, but if someone challenged that someday, he would be done for. That was why he could not afford to have any on such a level. Let's go. I was beginning to miss RA anyway. I suppose it's time for a reunion. After your next test, you will be able to enter the region with the curse. Due to your elevated nature as a result of your bond with Lotus, you won't suffer the passive curse the living curse is exuding. Originally, I was going to teach you how to seal the curse, but now I suggest you just avoid it and move on. We can deal with it once the deity is handled. Adds by Pub Future. As they walked, their actual speed much faster than it appeared, Fenrir appeared next to them. Lex had summoned the loyal pup long ago, and Matteo had taken it away immediately to help it train. Lex hadn't seen him since, but the pup looked completely relaxed, and not at all like he had undergone strenuous training the way Lex had. They were supposed to train together as well, but never got around to it. Perhaps Cassandra had saved it for the end. When they finally reached the gate for the next test, Lex found it wide open and waiting for him. As he was about to proceed, he discovered that Fenrir had sat down beside Cassandra. "Aren't you coming?" he asked, looking at the pup. "As your bonded beast, Fenrir does not need to take the test. When you gain sufficient authority to move forward, it will automatically accompany you. It also can't help you during the test, as you have to rely on yourself to proceed." Lex's lip twitched, but he said nothing about the blatant favoritism going on. Without wasting any time, he walked into the test. Cassandra had told him that she used her own authority to change his tests to one-on-one combat. They were comparatively more difficult than what he normally would have faced, but it was straightforward. Besides, with Lex's strength, neither of them were worried about him having a tough time in a fight. He entered, and was transported to a familiar arena, and an all-too-familiar suit of armor. As much as Lex would enjoy getting his revenge for all the times he bled to a suit of armor, this wasn't the time. The test generated by the temple would be according to Lex's cultivation level, which meant that even with the greater difficulty level, it was much weaker than the ones he had been training with the past few weeks. As soon as the temple asked him if he was ready, and he answered yes, the armor attacked. Its speed was exceptional, its strength phenomenal, and its technique amazing. A few weeks ago, Lex would have had to go through a few exchanges to win. Now, he just blinked behind it as soon as it swung, and with a speed far surpassing the suit of armor, cleaved it in half with his 8-feet-long massive sword. For him, the test was easy, but he was still annoyed that Fenrir didn't have to go through it. Grumbling to himself, he moved on. Chapter 9:17 Hot Dogs. Although Lex looked extremely confident in himself as he walked out, perhaps even arrogant, the truth was that he had not lowered his guard one bit, even when he technically defeated the suit of armor. If there was one thing he had learnt during his training with Cassandra, it was that he always had vulnerabilities in her eyes. Although he had grown tremendously, aided not only by his own efforts, but by the boost in comprehension provided by his cultivation technique, in her eyes he always had room for improvement. It was like she had her own version of his left eye, just that instead of seeing the vulnerabilities due to laws, she saw his weaknesses. The problem was, if she could do it, who was to say that others who had even a modicum of her experience couldn't do the same? They wouldn't even need to be as good as her, just identifying one weakness was enough. No matter how he tried to convince himself that it was due to special circumstances, and that his cultivation technique would eventually make him invincible, he had been wounded too many times to continue to believe it. After a certain amount of punishment, he even began to doubt the veracity of the claims of his cultivation techniques. Regardless, while he looked smug holding an 8-feet-long sword on his shoulder as he stepped into the new level, in reality he was ready for a fight to the death at a moment's notice. He emerged to find Fenrir and Cassandra waiting for him. He walked over and rubbed the pup's head, not letting his dissatisfaction show. At least Fenrir had not made any comments on his new baby form, not that he was insecure about it. Little did he know, in Fenrir's eyes, such a thing was only normal. After all, it regularly shrunk and grew its size, so it only made sense that Lex could do the same. If it returned to its normal size, as of right now, it would be as large as an elephant from Earth, or 135,316 hot dogs stacked upon one another. Fenrir turned his head and scratched it. That was a specifically odd number. Why did he know it? The pup did not have long to ponder, and Lex put away his sword and climbed onto its back. "Use your stealth to get us to the next entrance," Lex said, reminding the pup of its mission. Cassandra, who knew exactly where the curse was and what route to take to avoid it, led the way. The only reason they were being stealthy ways to avoid detection from the curse through some other means. Since they had not interacted with it yet, they did not know what it was capable of. Lex remained silent the entire time, ready for something to go wrong, as it usually did. He had begun to develop a theory about why he got caught in so many problems so frequently, but there was no way to test it for now. But for once, there were no problems. Fenrir's incredible stealth was as reliable as always, prompting Lex to stare at its fur for a while. Last time, he had used Orion's scale to help give his suit stealth properties. He wondered if adding some of Fenrir's fur would make it even better. Ads by Pub Future. Putting that thought aside, Lex entered the next test. Since Cassandra had already set the format, there would be no unexpected situations. But the difficulty of the test scaled significantly. This time, the suit of armor he faced radiated an aura at the peak of the nascent realm. Moreover, it was particularly heavy, as if it was strong even among its peers. It also did not hold any sword or any other physical weapon, meaning it likely would use some other means of attack. Summoning his sword, Lex selected yes on the option to begin the test, and this time attacked first. He solidified space around the suit of armor and blinked above it, swinging down to cut it in half. But the solidified space seemed to return to normal at the last moment, and the suit of armor evaded the sword with a single step. Before Lex could react, his surroundings changed and he was pulled into some kind of illusion. But before things could progress further, the illusion broke on its own, and the suit of armor reeled back. It was not so easy to cover an entire planet in an illusion, and acting on Lex was now basically the same thing. The suit of armor suffered a backlash from his failed technique, and Lex did not give it a chance to recover. His sword cleaved it apart with one hit. With the test over, Lex did not immediately exit to the next level, but stood over the suit of armor and took a deep breath. If the previous win had been a result of his own skill, this one relied on some of the various cheats he had accumulated on his person. That was not a good sign. He still had 2 or more tests to go through. A couple of thoughts ran through his mind. First, were there really so many people this skilled back when the temple was running? He got so far due to a number of boosts to his strength, cultivation, and skill he got, but he knew that such things weren't really replicable. So how did ordinary cultivators get through so many levels back then? This was keeping in mind that the temple members were actively trying to help him pass the tests. It was, quite frankly, both baffling and humbling. But that was just a fleeting thought. Since Lex had the resolution to be the best, he was ready to work hard to slowly and steadily become stronger. If others were as strong as him, he would surpass them eventually. The second thought was about employing some of the new sword techniques he had learned, as well as his other gains. Chapter 918 Inferno Blade. Lex was too used to simply smashing his enemies with his fists, or now that he was using swords, hammering them or cutting them with simple swipes. Randomly cleaving and swinging his sword was easier, but sword techniques were ultimately better and stronger. He sighed, and then moved on. This time when he exited, Cassandra and Fenrir were waiting for him, just as last time, but the difference was that Lex detected the subtlest hint of an amused look on Cassandra's face. No doubt she took notice of the fact that he took dozens of seconds more to pass this test than the last one. Clearing his throat, Lex moved on, pretending as if he didn't notice. Among the many things he experienced in the past few weeks, one of the most significant events was when he gave up his accumulating divinity. There were 2 divinities focused on his person, though all the divine energy granted through belief was funneled away by his system and stored to power his wish. Nonetheless, while unaware of how the belief tainted divine energy was being channeled away from him, Cassandra informed him that separating those 2 divinities from himself was a beneficial thing for him. After inquiring about what it would entail, and what he stood to gain or lose, he eventually agreed, and Cassandra helped him through the process. First, they identified the 2 divinities he had on his person. The first, and the stronger one, was easily identified as the butter knife deity. As unusual as it was, countless religions across hundreds of galaxies had already formed around that one attack from the butter knife he had unleashed. In fact, if the system had not been funneling away the belief-tainted divine energy, that particular divinity may have already matured. Cassandra did not ask questions about the odd divinity, or how it came out to be. Instead, she helped him fashion a ceremonial item in the form of a butter knife and helped him transfer the divinity over to it. The butter knife was incredibly weak, and would slowly grow stronger as it accumulated the power of belief. But in this case, it was not slow at all. With the divinity removed from himself, the system could no longer funnel it away, and the knife absorbed all of it. In a matter of days it had already reached a level that was comparable to the average weapon used by a golden core cultivator. Given time, it would grow even stronger. But there was a shortcut to strengthening it. Once he killed Ra, he could channel the divinity from his corpse into the knife, devouring his divinity to make his knife stronger. But Lex was not planning on doing that. Instead, he planned on strengthening the item fashioned from the second divinity. He pulled out a devilish mask and looked at it. This mask was the ceremonial item associated with his second divinity, the invincible tyrant. The number of believers in this were very few, but for some reason, their belief was strong enough to form a trace of divinity on him. The mask looked a lot like the one he wore when he used notorious anonymity. Lex had a strong guess over who his believers were. The few devils who had run away from him after trying to hurt him for hours. The fact that this currently incredibly weak mask continued to accumulate power meant that some of them, at least, were still alive. As he approached the next door, he put the mask on. These ceremonial items were linked to him, so others could not use them. Or, to be technical, they could not use them unless they killed Lex first. Ads by Pub Future. Divinities could be stolen by deities who attacked and devoured other deities. Therefore, these ceremonial items, which contained divinity and were linked to him, could also have their ownership transferred, if he was killed first. Or he could give up the ownership of his free will, but he had no interest in doing that. The butter knife was promising to become an extremely potent weapon in the future, and the mask was born of his own achievements. Both were good reasons to keep them to himself. But the mask had a potential, which he liked a lot. Notorious anonymity was ultimately a low-level technique. Eventually, he would outgrow it. By then he could just get a new technique to hide his identity, but if this mask of his grew strong enough, it could simply take over that role. Moreover, the mask had a few other benefits as well. Since the divinity it was formed from was invincible tyrant, it augmented his domination, to a degree, and boosted his strength and defense. Theoretically, once it grew strong enough, these side benefits could overshadow the original purpose of the mask, which was to hide his identity. That was why he had decided that when he killed Ra, he would strengthen his mask, not the knife. Without a word, he stepped through the door of the sixth test. His aura changed to that of the invincible tyrant, or rather, the invincible baby tyrant. The suit of armor he faced this time looked different compared to the ones he saw before. It was sleek and nimble, while at the same time exuding a strong deterrence. He knew immediately that this one was finally strong enough to break through his defenses and hurt him. Lex had no doubt of his own victory, but what he was focused on right now was a quick and efficient victory. He decided to go all out from the very beginning. The moment he began the test, Lex blasted his domination in full, and displayed the latest addition to his arsenal of techniques, Inferno Blade. The sound of thunder accompanied his attack as his sword, now turned red from its usual silverish gray due to heat, cut through the arena. Though the enemy was far away, it was still within reach of the attack. At the apogee of its swing, a red energy seemed to shoot out from the tip of the blade and cut through the armor before it could even react. By the time Lex completed his sword swing and looked over, the suit of armor was already melting. Chapter 919 Inner Temple. Lex heaved a little, and swung his right arm in the air, as if trying to stretch out his muscles. Inferno Blade was not a single attack, but a collection of 6 attacks, each one adding fire component to the attack. The one Lex had used right now was the only long-range one he had learnt so far. It could not be mastered without knowing at least some basic sword intent, as it relied on the intent to carry the attack forward. Of the 6, Lex immediately learned the first 3, as if they were completely natural. The next 3, however, Lex was used to studying. He'd been homeschooled and then went to college. After he became a cultivator, he studied all kinds of things, as he was aware that he lacked a foundation in them. One could even say he was good at studying, especially now that his brain had undergone a few upgrades. But he was used to studying concrete things. He studied math, science, programming, and the like. Heck, even art and music had symmetry and patterns, so although he never studied them much, he could comprehend them. The Inferno Blade's last 3 moves, however, were an entirely different matter. Unlike the first 3, which only relied on a certain level of swordsmanship, sword intent and technique, the latter were strange, and relied on things that Lex could not comprehend. The technique description sounded almost philosophical, and the instructions included things like the feelings of the blade as the fire within it rises, the beginning, end, and middle of an inferno as being a living being and that engulfed the evils of the world. Lex read the descriptions multiple times and then asked Cassandra again, just to be sure his translator wasn't malfunctioning. Cassandra found his reaction amusing, and she almost seemed relieved that there was something he struggled with. In her words, if everything came too easily to him, it would weaken his willpower. So, mastering the remaining 3 would have to wait. It was not as if Lex was unfamiliar with using techniques in battle, but so far the techniques he had used were more or less straightforward. They either blocked or hit something. Impervious hands seemed to be the only exception to the rule, as it became something else entirely when he used it. But for some reason, he felt a kind of resistance while using sword techniques. He suspected that the sword in his soul might be responsible for that. Besides Inferno Blade, Lex had also learned a defensive sword technique called Stalwart Guardian, but unlike Inferno Blade, Lex mastered that in its entirety. It seemed that even with the regal embrace gone, he was still influenced by it, as the vague and philosophical lines did not deter him at all, much to Cassandra's regret. Lex put the sword away and exited. Next would be his 7th test. Unless RA broke through the layers in the next few minutes, Lex would finally face him after passing the next test. He was not nervous, but he took it quite seriously. Cassandra had told him that RA was regaining power rapidly, which wasn't good. Once he exited the test chamber, he discovered that the appearance of the temple changed drastically. The halls were no longer massive and wide, and instead looked more regal and yet cozy. There were no paintings or decorations filling the walls, but Lex felt like the hall was the most grand he had ever been in, though he could not say why. He felt reinvigorated by just breathing the air, and the soft, pastel colors of the walls seemed to soothe his mind and fill him with a cool sensation. He felt like his body was subtly growing stronger just by standing there, and that his cultivation was increasing as well. Most of all, he felt like his soul itself was growing stronger. Wow! Lex could not help but utter, and then was surprised to discover that his voice was different. It sounded better, somehow. You are now entering the inner portions of the temple. Do not be surprised by just this. By inner portion, I do not mean you are reaching the core of the temple, just that you are reaching a slightly better furnished corner of the temple based on your location. Come, let's not waste time. Lex followed Cassandra, and in only a few steps felt like he had already replenished whatever energy he had expended so far. Every subsequent step he took gave him surplus energy, as if augmenting him. Why is my voice different? He could not resist asking. It's due to something called ether. It's one of the more pure types of energies, alongside divinity. At your level, you don't need to worry about it. Your voice, this is just the best version of your voice that you can achieve. It can only exist in the presence of ether. Lex did not fail to notice that Cassandra's voice did not change. When they finally reached the entrance to the next test, Lex was stunned. He sensed an aura that was all too familiar from the door. It was emanating dragon's might. Albeit, the aura was weak. The aura is there to deter others from taking these tests lightly. They are not easy. Take this one seriously, or you won't escape unharmed. Lex nodded, and walked through the doors that seemed to open on their own as he approached. Somehow, Lex felt like the doors were reacting to his domination. The test area also looked different. Instead of a small arena inside a closed room, Lex found himself standing in the center of a massive stadium, though there was no crowd. The sun hung directly overhead, marking it as midday, and the faint smoke rising from the ground told Lex that it was probably searing. He did not even feel warm. A suit of armor appeared in front of him, though this one was taller than the last one by a few inches, and looked much more intimidating than the last one too. It almost looked like a humanoid dragon. Chapter 920 Space Techniques. Lex wore a solemn expression as he looked at his foe. The suit of armor emanated an aura that felt quite dangerous to him, and his instincts were subtly warning him that his enemy was dangerous, something that had not happened even against the suits of armor that made him bleed when he was training. The armor looked lean, and yet extremely powerful and durable. Its curves were satisfyingly smooth, and in certain places such as his shoulders, elbows, and the top of the helmet, it grew out as if replicating flames. The armor was a soft shade or red, though on the flames, the color was more intense. Unlike the previous suits of armor, this one did not wield a massive, double-handed sword, but instead carried a sword and shield combination. Somehow, Lex doubted he could melt this one so easily. A smile grew on his face. Fighting was only interesting when it was challenging. He had improved a lot in the recent past. He was eager to see how strong he had become. Lex summoned his sword and got into position before beginning the test. Lex actually struggled to see the armor move, but his training and instincts guided his movements. Their swords clashed, ushering forth a rain of sparks and the sounds of thunder. Before Lex could do anything else, as he was already reeling from the absurd might packed into that sword attack, the shield bashed him in the face. But, unexpectedly, Lex was not sent flying back. Lex hardened the space around his legs to hold him in place and bashed the shield back. Who said his face was weaker than equipment? Lex's brain, which was working at full speed, made an observation that if he had blocked using Stalwart Guardian, he would have gained the advantage in the previous exchange. It was a reminder to rely on his techniques. But while he had a momentary lapse with his sword techniques, he did not fail with others. He blinked up into the air above the suit of armor. As if predicting where Lex would appear, the suit of armor was already turning to attack. Red flames had appeared around it like tentacles and all swung towards Lex as if they were sentient. A trace of dragon's might appeared and tried to hold Lex down. But whether it was flames or dragon's might, he already had an incredible resistance towards them. Instead of a sword attack, Lex used one of the two space-based techniques he had learned as he punched out. Space warp. Right in front of his space, for a region of 3 feet, 0.9 meters, space seemed to bend oddly. Someone observing would think it was just a lighting trick or illusion, but that was not the case. This incredibly lethal technique, which Lex could only employ in a very limited range for now, drastically warped space in a small region. While the warping itself was already incredibly deadly, that was only one of the traits of the attack. The second was a sudden, massive spike in gravity that lasted only a few moments. Despite its short duration, the extent of the gravity increase was enough to shatter even the strongest of materials. The suit of armor, which had been caught in his attack, was dealt a severe blow. Its shield broke, and its armor was covered in cracks, before the effects of gravity even showed themselves. Then the armor began to deform, as its chest and back caved in slightly. For a moment Lex thought the fight would be over, but then his instinct screamed a warning. Instantly, Lex blinked away only to see another suit of armor had appeared in the air, right behind where he had been, and had been moments away from decapitating him. The broken and battered suit of armor disappeared, as if it were a mirage, leaving only the completely unharmed suit, falling from the sky. For a moment Lex was confused. How had it dodged his attack? Lex hadn't sensed anything, or even detected its arrival behind him. But he did not have long to think, for the moment the armor landed, the fight continued. Sparks flew in the air as this time Lex did not forget to use his techniques, and craters formed in the ground, the stadium being the only thing seemingly suffering from their clashes. The suit of armor brought out its techniques, which favored fire and dragon's might, but Lex could basically ignore them. But oddly enough, the suit of armor could also ignore all his space-based attacks, and was skilled enough to dodge or parry all his sword attacks. They fought, and fought, and fought some more. Lex risked sustaining injuries to attack, but never actually suffered any damage, or managed to hurt the armor. They seemed to reach an impasse. When the fight kept on continuing like this, and 5 minutes passed, Lex decided he could no longer afford to wait. Every moment he delayed was getting stronger. He had to use the second space technique he mastered, which he was trying to avoid using. Not only did it exhaust him mentally and drain a truly massive portion of his energy reserves, but Lex himself also suffered when it was used. He entered his berserk state, and blared his domination in full. His berserk state increased his physical abilities tremendously, which is exactly what he needed. Taking the armor by surprise with his increased speed, he body slammed it and immediately put it in a bear hug, ignoring the flames that covered its body. Space unraveling. Although a moment ago the two had been hurtling across the stadium due to Lex's body slam, they suddenly froze in place. The space around them slowly began to break down, as if turning to ash. But as the ashes fell, they unraveled and turned into something else. Whether it was Lex's clothes, Lex himself or the suit of armor, all were cut through as they were touched by the transforming ash. It was not the void behind space, which would eventually be revealed if this attack continued, that was dangerous. No, it was the extremely potent, powerful and dangerous energy that space was made out of, that it unraveled into, that was the danger. And if that energy touched Lex's golden core, he would basically be crippled. But Cassandra had already taught him how to avoid that, so all that remained was for him to mutually suffer some damage with this accursed suit of armor.